Good morning and welcome after a long break to Coffee, Buses and Politics. Partly because we've been lazy, partly because my job now requires me that I'm in Peterborough 5 days a week, which is obviously a lovely place to go, but also means I can't do a podcast on a Friday morning. So we've been looking for alternative times. And the one we've kind of agreed on so far is Sunday at some time. So we're doing it a Sunday morning now, but we might do Sunday evening sometimes too. So if you're listening, thank you for sticking with us. I'm here with Martin and Alex, and David's on holiday. Is he somewhere exotic? Do we know? Do you know where he is or not?
I think he's in Wales.
Oh, so not exotic.
So not anywhere exotic.
Yes, but he's taking a well-deserved break after like all the elections and post-election period. So hopefully he'll come back to Coffee, Buses and Politics refreshed.
And I think that's the other axis is that everybody, well, not me because I wasn't involved, was quite kind of knackered by the elections, which is always quite hard work if you're a candidate or supporting candidates as well. Martin's also just back from Dubai and not long after his other holiday across the whole of America. So that's another reason why we skipped it, so we didn't have to listen to his holiday record.
You forgot the trip to Germany as well.
Yeah, whatever. Nobody's interested in Martin. Right. So this morning we've got a few topics on the agenda, and the first is so since we speak to you after the county council elections, which basically have changed the face of the county council, haven't they? So the previous, well, when we were elected just over 4 years ago, we had a relatively strong Conservative opposition, which finished with 27 councillors or something, and after the election that was down to 10, and we have 10 Reform councillors. Then a smaller. How many Labour members are there now, Alex?
So there are 5 down from 10 previously,
and 2 Indies down to 3 from 3, and quite a lot of extra Green councillors, which is so it's a very different makeup. Does it feel very different in the chamber? You've only had one big meeting so far, but it must feel a bit different.
Yes, we only had the AGM so far, and obviously like also the committee appointments. So there are new people on new committees. So for example, I was previously on Children and Young People and Vice Chair of Communities. Now obviously I'm in opposition. I'm still on communities, but in opposition, and I'm the only Labour member on Highways and Transport at the moment. So the first meeting is on the 17th of June with a very interesting agenda we can chat about as we get closer to the meeting. I think it's published next week, but yes, I think there are a lot of changes, and it does feel different because now it is a Lib Dem majority of one, and everyone else is in opposition. But the opposition is not a united opposition because, of course, you have 10 Conservatives, 10 Reform, 3 Greens, 5 Labour, 2 Independents. So there's no kind of, it doesn't look like you have a main opposition because it's 10 Reform, 10 Conservatives, and if you added everyone else together, it will be 10 as well. So it's a bit of a mix at the moment.
So and all that means not only is there a different party makeup, but there's also lots of new councillors, who are finding their feet, and some of them are working out how they have to behave in a very responsible role. And so the biggest news story, I think, of the new county council was from the Children and Young People's Committee that happened, I think, just at the end of May. And the controversy was that a newly elected Reform councillor, Andy Osborne. Do you know where Andy's from at all?
Is he Woolsoken? He's somewhere around one of the Wisbech seats, anyway.
Yeah, I think it's Roman Bank and Packover.
Yeah, it might be. Yeah.
So he's from Fenland, and he made. They were talking about young people in care, which I think, I've never been sat on that committee, but I know that across the previous county council, every time we talked about the care system, it was always a subject that excited everybody, because I think every single councillor in the previous administration was very concerned about people in care and wanted the best for them. But during the debate, which I haven't seen, Councillor Osborne made a comment saying that some children in care are just not just naughty children, but they can be downright evil. He said he'd heard of cases where youngsters were smashing cars up, running away from home, and were on drugs. It's not just a case of being somebody being a bad boy or a bad girl. It's a case that they haven't learned from their bad parents not to react correctly. Now, okay, the language he uses is awful, and I think we'd all agree that the sentiment, everybody seems to agree that the sentiments are it's mainly the comments that young people in care can be evil, So some of the things that he describes, that young people smash cars up, run away from home, and are on drugs are undoubtedly true, yeah, because people who end up in the care system, yeah, have very troubled backgrounds typically, yeah, and that has consequences on their behaviour. So what do you guys think about those comments?
I'll let you go first, Alex, because I'm going to go off on one.
Okay, I'll keep my comments brief then if you have an entire speech to make, Martin. But yeah, I wasn't, as I said, I'm not on children's committee anymore, but I've been on children's committee for the previous administration for 4 years, and also been the Labour member for the corporate parenting subcommittee, which looks specifically, of course, at children in local authority care. And when I saw that comment, obviously it was immediately told on the kind of counselors chat we have, like, this comment was made, and it was really inappropriate. Like, I have to say, I mean, the first thing I was thinking in my head is like, okay, you're a new counselor, you show up to your first children's committee, and that's what you say, instead of perhaps, maybe like reading your corporate parenting responsibilities as a counselor, maybe attending some trauma-informed training to like actually understand some of the reasons why perhaps you notice some of the behaviors you're referring to. But even if those behaviors existed, right, I think it's just so unfair to just make that comment and to call any child evil. If you were like any other parent and you called your child evil, you'd probably people will comment that you're not really fit to be a parent, so why would you be fit to be a corporate parent, using that language. So I have to say it's like really disappointing. I think we see this kind of divisive language which doesn't help anyone. Like, you saying that on committee doesn't make doesn't address any of the issues in the care system. And of course it also hurts people who are in the care system. I have like a couple of friends of mine who are care experienced, and they live in Cambridgeshire, including one friend of mine, Kerry, who wrote some articles and comments in the media about this. And obviously this language does affect them, because you're looking at your elected representatives on the county council making those comments about you, and obviously you just feel very negatively about this. And I think it's like fair enough that some people with care experience, young people, did comment as a result of this, and some of those comments have been featured in the media as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with absolutely everything that's out there. I do think, first of all, the point you make that it doesn't do anybody any good making comments like that. But the issue is that it does harm. And just as a very simple, easy explanation of the sort of time when it could do harm, we have to find accommodation for young people who are in care. Okay, and getting young people accommodation for difficult young people through the planning system is really, really difficult because of reactions from neighbours and everything else. So what you've got here now is a quote for neighbours to pick up and use in planning committee meetings when they are raising objections to new care homes and changes to care homes. So as a very simple issue on the surface, that shows where this has done harm. What struck me as interesting about this is I've talked a lot about the fact that I think there are similarities between what was UKIP 10 years ago and what we have now with Reform 12 years ago. And I remember just after the election 12 years ago, a UKIP councillor standing up at a briefing meeting where we were talking about care, and we had children in care come in and talk to us about what life was in care. He stood up and asked one of these children, what is it like being a taker from society? Okay. And so straight away, we can start to see the same sort of conduct and behaviour from Reform councillors as we saw from UKIP. And as a result of that, I with the work I do around housing, I get involved in all sorts of different councils, and I've been coming across these stories a little bit, and I did a quick 10-minute dig in the last little while. In the few minutes before this, we went live. The things that are going on around at the moment, there are 12 UKIP Reform councillors under investigation at the moment because of comments that they have made that are reflecting the views of Britain First, reflecting the views of Tommy Robinson, or reflecting the views, at least in one case, of a Holocaust denier. A number of councils that are now UKIP controlled are suspending meetings, and have no meeting. One council, I think, has suspended pretty much all of its meetings in the first month, because the councillors just don't know what they're doing. We've had other councillors that have been suspended. So one of the councillors that's under investigation is in West Northants. There's another one already been suspended in West Northants. We've got obviously Andy Osborne's comments. And you could go on, and then you've got this issue about this Doge team that's gone into Kent. And if I was a chief executive, I wouldn't let them through the door. But the leader of the county council has said that they will consider anybody that obstructs the Doge team as committing gross misconduct, and that's not their call. That is absolutely not a councillor's call to describe and decide whether an officer has committed gross misconduct.
There was also Nigel Farage making comments, I think about Durham, about anybody who's involved in a diversity inclusion role or in a climate change role should start looking for another job, which is, I don't know, from an employment perspective, that seems really, really, really dodgy, employment law perspective, but just, morally, for officers, I'm sure they've got some great officers in those roles, how utterly, utterly demoralising that must be.
No, absolutely. And the issue for me is we've only just started. This is a month into the new administration, and I do note, by the way, that Councillor Osborne has had he's been removed from that committee, and I think the leader of the reform group has said I think he's going to take his place. The issue for me, though, is I think Councillor Osborne needs to ask whether, if you can't get to grips with the complexities and the sort of language that you need to conduct yourself responsibly, not just as a corporate parent, but as a councillor, he needs to seriously question whether he is in the right place as a county councillor. And that's the truth for me, because the reality is he's made these comments about the children looked after. He'll probably be careful for the next couple of months, on whatever committee he goes on to. But as soon as his guard's down, you bet your bottom dollar something else will come out.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's not good for the county council. It's not good for reform, but it's also not good for the county council. And I have real concerns about this. The other thing that's interesting is, by the way, that reform are not approving that they can't form coalitions to run councils as well, which is one of the things they said, because the Conservatives, who are the ones you would have thought most likely going to do it, are basically saying they don't know what they're doing and they've got no agenda because they campaigned on a national ticket, which is what we were saying during the election campaign.
Yeah. Going back to this behaviour in the Children and Young People's Committee, so I don't have any personal experience of the care system, well, first-hand experience, but I am an adopter, and I adopted my son when he was 3 years old from the care system, and I think we were really lucky that my son had a positive experience from the care system, as much as can possibly be the case. But when you go through the adoption process, and especially like 20 years ago when we did it, what you end up doing is you have these catalogs full of children who want to be, who need to be adopted, and you get to, if you're interested in them, you get to read the case notes, and almost every single one of those stories is so traumatic that you couldn't read it. You'd be able to read one a night at most, and it would really, really affect you, because even children like my son, who had a relatively good experience with the care system and was with a love. I mean, I have all the love in the world for foster parents and foster families, because they take really, really damaged children, and they show them love, and that's what happened to my son. But I remember talking to an adult who was an adoptee, talking about me as an adopter, and she said that even adopters don't understand that all children from the care system there's a book I've got here, it's called The Primal Wound, which is a really difficult book to read if you're an adopter, just talking about the fundamental damage that happens to young people in the care system with attachment, because they've been let down by their parents, ultimately. And those, no matter how good things are, my son's 23 now, no matter how you think that he hasn't been affected by it, all of them are affected by it as well. And so it's not surprising that in some of the more difficult cases that young people go off the rails and get involved in violence and drugs, and actually lots of sexualized behavior, which is awful as well. There's lots of that. but that's never, it's almost never their fault, is it? It's the fault of the people who brought them into the world and society as a whole. And we all have to be responsible for the consequences of those things. Sorry, Martin.
So I think I was cabinet member for young people for a while when I was a councillor, and I used to we used to have a looked after children's panel where some representatives from looked after children used to sit around a table and talk about life in care. They used to talk about the business that we were doing as a council that related to looked after children, and make sure that the looked after child's voice was there within our policies. And it was, of all the meetings I did, it's the one I enjoyed the most. And the reason I enjoyed it was because these children were absolutely remarkable. And I do get quite angry about how bad we are as a country in terms of how we manage and deal with looked after children. We take on this role of corporate parent, as a state, and all too often we don't do a good enough job. And yes, these children come into care and they've got issues because of chaotic backgrounds and whatever, and we need to look at what are the best examples in the world, and we need to be saying, how do we learn from that, how do we apply that in the UK, so that every single child that leaves the care system in the UK leaves as a mature adult that is that is able to properly contribute. Instead, what we do is increasingly children that have been in care, end up going through the prison system and stuff like that. And I am really critical about how poor we are as a country about dealing with care. And I suspect there's a spend to save measure to say, if we get this right earlier on, we can save a huge amount of money further down the road. But that's something else we'll rubbish out as a state.
Yeah, and I'd imagine on those committees, in general, almost unanimously, there would be, this is not a political issue, and people like Simon Bywater, who used to be a UKIP councillor, is a Conservative councillor now. Actually, a good friend of mine as well, a brilliant councillor, is always one of the loudest voices for young people in care, and it's like across the whole chamber. That's one thing we never disagreed on ever. I don't think.
I'll say this, and there's something about this and about reform at the moment. And Simon, Simon is a great example of it. I think Simon knew early on in the council when he was first elected that he was a duck out of water as far as UKIP was concerned. He didn't belong there. And the reason he became a UKIP councillor was because they asked him and we didn't, I think is a reality. And there will be reform councillors sat in the council chamber in Cambridgeshire at the moment, looking around them and saying, who am I aligned with? And there'll be people doing that. And I would say, and my advice to them is, jump ship now. And jump now, either to an independent or another party, whichever you want to do, but jump ship now before you start getting tainted with the behaviour and the comments of the people around you. Because Simon was I used to say that UKIP was two wings. There was the normal wing and there was the sensible wing. And Simon was 100% part of the sensible wing of UKIP. There's no two ways about it.
Yeah, he's a top bloke. He's one of my favourite councillors. All right, I think let's move on from that. That's the other thing. Another thing we're going to discuss. I think there's been some issues reported in the press and locally around here about the struggle to recruit parish councils. Just up the road in Croxton from me, the whole parish council resigned recently, and you've got some stories, haven't you, Martin, about parish councils that are struggling to recruit members?
Yeah. I mean, same again. The work I do around development. I was in a parish council in Cambridgeshire on Friday. Really, I wasn't. It's actually the parish clerk and somebody else that was present at the meeting. And it was a really, really good meeting. There's no two ways about it. But one of the things in my research beforehand and everything was I came up with the fact that they've got 5 vacancies. They've got a lot of parish councillors on that parish, but they've got 5 vacancies. And I was sitting there and thinking there must be people who are interested in politics but are on the edges of politics. And I wouldn't advise anybody to get involved and be a parish councillor to be political, because you shouldn't be. But I would say, if you're interested in understanding more about our political system, with a view to maybe standing in future, just look around, see what vacancies your parish have got, and see if you've got a role there. Because it's not good for your communities to have that many vacancies, and we need to start filling them. So if you get an opportunity, please do it. And I do see it elsewhere as well. And it's not just Cambridgeshire; everywhere you sort of see similar problems.
Yes, I think it's everywhere. And I mean, like, so for example, in Knightingworth and Holywell, I think there are 2 at the moment that have been advertised for a while. And I think in most areas there are vacancies which will not end up in an election because it takes so long to recruit, and most parish councillors would be co-opted, although in some of the town councils there are often elections as well, because it can be a bit more competitive. But yeah, I agree with Martin. I think it's a great way to be involved, especially in your local area. You have to usually live within, I think it's 3 miles from the parish boundary, so most people are really local. Obviously discuss like very local issues. It's not a political role in the sense that like a county councillor is, or indeed standing for parliament. So I think for other people who don't want to get into the party politics and actually want to resolve like very practical issues locally, I think it's a great role, and I try to encourage people in my own area as well. But I think I see this decline of people wanting to put their name forward in any kind of volunteer role. If you look at school governors, for example, across Cambridgeshire, again, there's so many vacancies compared to how it's been in the past. I recently, because the county council sent an email a few months ago asking us if any of us wants to put their name forward as county councillors to be a school governor, and I started about over half a year ago now, and I think it's a great experience for me. It's like we're having been on the children's committee on the end of the county policy, actually being a governor and seeing how some of those policies impact the school, and like participating in that is really different type of experience, which is really, really valuable. But again, with governors, there are so many vacancies. I'm not sure about other areas, but in St. Ives, some of the schools have 2 or 3, I think, vacancies in the governor bodies as well, which are constantly advertised.
How do you find the time, man? That's something else on a long list.
That's how I started off as a school governor, by the way. That was my introduction to politics. I got involved in the council issue as a vice chair of governors at Alderman Jacobs School, and that's what dragged me slowly in. And I agree. And it's worth saying, if you're interested in parish council roles, it's worth repeating what Alex said, that you wouldn't necessarily, almost certainly wouldn't have to stand for election if you are looking at going to parish council. They can co-op you on.
Yeah. I mean, so back when I was a county councillor, I had and a district councillor, still district councillor. I had 9 parish councils on my patch, which I had to visit regularly, and very, very few of those were elected through the ballot box. They were all co-options, which actually is fine, I think, basically. Or apart from in one notable case where the whole parish council seemed on the border of corruption and had most of their meetings behind closed doors. But I think that's been resolved now. I think the whole role of parish councils, despite the fact they're struggling to recruit people, is going to become increasingly important, because we're going to talk about LGR in just a second. But as we move towards LGR, we're moving away from a local model of democracy to a much bigger kind of unitary model. So in terms of devolution, we're going to go away from having district councils to having much bigger unitaries, which are the size of at least 2, 3, 4 district councils, which means that the local voice is going to have to come from even more, I think, from parish and town councils. I mean, I think HTC does a really good job of putting its arm around parish councils. We've got a parish council forum coming up in June, and we're having a flooding event in July for parish councils and flood action groups. Listening to their voices, because they are the most engaged people in the local communities. And I can understand why people don't want to do it, because as usual, being a councillor is a pretty thankless task. You get involved in controversial issues, which gets everybody's backs up, and 90% of the time nobody's interested. You do it in front of an empty hall. So I can understand the struggle, but I do think that they're very important. And actually, despite the fact I had so many of them, some of the most fun times I've had as a council is sitting explaining things to parish councillors who always look up at us county and district councillors, because we're the experts in everything from their point of view, even though we're not experts in anything. That's always their involvement and their engagement with the whole of local government is always really inspiring, I think.
I mean, it's worth saying that I've been involved in the past in peer reviews of councils that had moved to unitaries, and for the most, they do find ways through area structures and whatever to try and keep that proximity and that connection to the ground. But I mean, there's a reality where some of that is going to diminish, because if you really, really want to speed up planning and make it more effective, part of the reason for the move to unitaries is to enable that.
Yeah, I mean, the previous county council had a very clear agenda at the start for devolution and establishing these local area committees, and actually never happened at all. And despite the fact, I mean, it was led by the Lib Dems, who's part of their agenda. It's not going to happen now, is it? Under this kind of romp county council, which has only got a few years, and so we're going to have to wait for the unitaries. But yeah, definitely, I think most people will be in favour of more local decision making. But at the moment, parish councils are probably...
It's not local decision making. I have a view that decision making, the best decision making, is a combination of top down and bottom up. And so what it is you know, the ultimate deciders, ultimately, you know, the decisions are made top down, but it's how you listen to the view that comes from the bottom up and how you implement that within your decisions that is important to me. And it's making sure that that view is heard and is shown to be heard, I think, is important.
And also local resource allocation as well. You know, people want to spend their money on different things. So I'm not sure it's a good example of that, but the local highways initiative scheme in Cambridgeshire, where communities get to bid for money. I mean, you know, sometimes it doesn't work out, and it feels like you're buying a lottery ticket to get your roads improved. But actually, that's the way that local communities can have a voice and put and bid for money. So definitely more of that. Anything else to say on parish councils? Should we move on to the bigger and juicier topic of local government reorganisation?
Just to say on LHIs, I think that's a great example of things that could be devolved to parish or town councils, like smaller highways projects. Like, we know when unitaries are implemented, that's one of the issues that, like, you know, could be looked at, like some of the community grant schemes as well, like the very like smaller local level stuff, because at the end of the day, it's town at the town and parish level. You know, the groups that are active, that you actually like know, you know, which local highways improvements would be best for the local area, which areas need to be 20 mile an hour as opposed to 30 and things like that. So I think like there's a scope to devolve some of the smaller highways budgets and powers. But yeah, again, I'm not the person involved in those.
But also how to write the best bids, though, because you'll see that a small number of parish councils get an unfair amount of... It doesn't happen in cities so much, but in the areas where we've got parish councils, the best parish councils get more money because they're writing the best bids and getting money from everywhere. So that's from LHI bids, that's from things like the SIL bids from community infrastructure levy we get from house buildings, and also things like the A421, 421, 80, A428, 421 up. They've got big, you know, treasure chests. A14 had them. The best, most engaged parish councils can do a fabulous amount for raising money for their communities, and so that's why we need them.
I agree.
It's a skill. Right. LGR then. So we've been talking about LGR for ages. It all kicked off, didn't it, about Christmas, didn't it? I think that the Labour government dropped the bombshell that they were basically doing away with district and county councils, and all the authorities that have a district and a county council were going to be changed into unitaries. And this has been done by kind of like on a consent basis, that, you know, the existing districts and counties at this stage are trying to work out how to best form themselves together into a smaller number of unitaries. And kind of the rough guide for the size of a unitary is about 500,000 people. And so the whole of the current kind of Cambridgeshire County Council, well, the whole of the current combined authority patch, which includes Peterborough, which is a bit bigger than the county council, is just under 1 million people. And so the sensible thing you'd probably think is we're looking at a split of perhaps 2 unitaries. And so the big topic of discussion, not in public, because most of these meetings are being held by leaders behind closed doors, is how those district councils reorganize themselves into unitaries. And I think those discussions are going. I because I'm on the cabinet at HDC, I am peripherally involved in, well, I'm not involved in the discussions, but I'm consulted on the discussions. But but there's not much I can say about the potential options at the moment. But they are discussing options and trying to come to a conclusion. I think the idea is that the district and county councils have to come to their own conclusion and submit their plans for the new unitaries by November. And if they don't, then the government will just decide for them, I think is the plan. What are you hearing from county council, Alex?
I'm not, I mean, unlike you, I'm not involved directly in those discussions, although I have expressed my view, whether it's like to, discussions to the my group leader or in other forums. But I mean, the main thing that interests me is the evidence behind splitting it one way or another, whether that's financial sustainability of the council. Like we all know that the districts in our area, there are varying degrees of like sustainability in terms of their council tax base and how the financial decisions that have been made over the last few years in some of the districts. You hear people saying like, oh, I don't want to go with that council because that will be a disaster financially, as opposed to going into Cambridge City. I think you have to look at the whole area and how the services can be sustainable, as well as overlap with other things as well, such as the health services and so on. So I think looking at purely at population, saying okay, we have to have 500,000 in each, without considering potential growth, travel to work areas, transport projects, and so on, is a bit simplistic. So I think what might be the easier option is not necessarily what's the best option long term, especially when you factor in some of the growth planned in the area. What I don't want to see personally is like a very kind of small, like Cambridge-centric, Cambridge and surrounding villages only unitary, and everyone else. Because especially given the plans to expand around Cambridge and South Cambs as well. So if you have a very kind of small unitary, I'm not sure how that would work, leaving everyone else outside it, given that people in reality, even if you build a lot more in Cambridge, on the outskirts of Cambridge, the reality will be a lot of your workers in Cambridge, working in the Cambridge businesses, will be commuting from places like St Ives, like Huntington, like South Cambridgeshire villages, places like Waterbeach, and even Ely and other towns as well. So we have to look a bit broader than, okay, we want to kind of contain Cambridge City in this like small and hopefully more, I mean, in some people's views, like politically coherent unitary. And the final thing I will make about politics, because people think about like how will it look politically. I think we're seeing like now, and we've seen this in the last local elections, and we'll see it in the unitary elections, we don't have any more Labour versus Conservative fights or Lib Dem versus Labour fights in the city. We have 5 or 6 candidates, and definitely in the unitary, especially if you get rid of the district and you have so many councillors who've been on the district, there will be candidates from probably almost every party in those new unitary elections. So to me, the argument that like which was would work best politically is not a good argument to take into account, because who knows what will happen. We'll have elections where councillors will be elected on 20-30% of the vote on a 6-5 way contest. It's not anymore how it used to be 10 years ago. So kind of planning anything around what would happen in the elections is a bit premature in my view, and it doesn't really reflect the political reality at the moment.
That was the message from the district council count, wasn't it, at the start of May? Yeah, I was there as a helper rather than a candidate, but like it seemed that on very few occasions was the winning candidate obvious, and everybody had a fight on their hands, which is great for democracy, isn't it? What we really want is to have 5 decent candidates in every seat, fighting it out on the best, well, hopefully the best person getting elected, but that's not the way it is. Martin, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I would much prefer that councillors were elected by PR, but that's another matter. But to me, the big fear I have is the gerrymandering, and we've got basically at the moment not signed, sealed, and delivered, but 2 Labour councils in the 2 cities. I think Peterborough's still just about Labour run, isn't it?
Just about, yeah.
Yeah. And it's how much influence and undue influence. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, because, as a Conservative council with a Conservative government, you can exercise influence. But how much influence they will have in the process bothers me a little bit. And I agree with Alex that the one thing we absolutely do not need is a South Cambs and City Council. It can't just be that. The way, when you look at the map and you look at the numbers, you can basically draw a line that effectively goes, I think it's northeast to southwest in Cambridgeshire, that splits Cambridgeshire into two, which is Cambridge City, South Cambs and East Cambs. And then on the other side, Fenland, Peterborough and Huntingdonshire. Now, as far as Fenland's concerned, I don't care. I live in Fenland. I see how bad my council is. And I don't think that any change, I think they don't particularly deserve a voice, is the reality. Yes, they should exercise a voice and exercise influence, and there's certain things they need to protect. But Fenland is going to be part of Cambridgeshire, part of Peterborough. I think that's true, but it's how you protect things like free parking that is really, really important, and that's the stuff that we need to look at. I feel in the midst of that for Huntingdonshire. I think Huntingdonshire are the losers in that. Is a reality, because Huntingdonshire has a lot to gain from being part of Cambridgeshire, but part of Greater Cambridge, and so that's my fear. I'm a big fan of unitaries, by the way. I do think they'll save money. One of my concerns is that one of the places you could save money is adult social care, but actually we will move. It looks like we will move from 2 councils looking after adult social care to 2 councils looking after adult social care. So the savings aren't going to come from that. And that's a shame, because adult social care is one of the big places where, if we can make savings, we should.
I'm also a fan of unitaries. I really am, because, having served as a town councillor, district councillor and a county councillor, but never on a combined authority, because I'm an independent and they won't let me anywhere near combined authority board places, which is another bone of contention. But it's too complicated. It's complicated for everybody, and nobody, and even we don't understand sometimes where the division between the different councils is, and we definitely don't understand who owns all the resources. Because if you get an issue with a lamppost in St Neots, it could be any one of 3 councils, it could be in charge of it, and quite often none of them know either, and that's not good enough.
I agree.
So I'd agree with Alex that the decisions need to be made on a data basis, but the trouble is that data is not very clear, and can be interpreted in multiple ways, and you're not going to get a clear decision. It's very true that the probably 2 unitaries both have to be financially viable, and it's no good having all the resources and all the economic kind of growth and economic value in one of those councils while the other one's going to go bust in a few years inevitably. That's not good enough. So that balancing that out, I think, is a primary concern for everyone.
There's also this issue, which is quite right, that places like Huntingdon and St Neots and St Ives, take a look towards Cambridge City, but actually when you look at Yaxley and Sawtry, you can't say that. And so, I know Angela Rayner has said within the guidelines that current council boundaries are not sacrosanct, and I think that needs to be looked at a little as well. Is there a sensible division of Huntingdonshire so you could push some to Peterborough and some to Greater Cambridge unitary?
Well, there's also the cost of splitting assets is huge, but also lots of these councils are already in bed with each other. So City, South Cambs and Huntingdonshire all already share a lot of services. So City and South Cambs share planning services.
Yep.
All the other stuff, IT and lots of other things, are shared between a shared company called 3Cs. And we've already looked at, we just renewed some of those contracts before all the LGR stuff was announced, and looked at the cost of breaking the contracts, as you do, and it's enormous. And it takes years to disentangle. We saw at the beginning of the last county council the final efforts to disentangle Cambridgeshire County Council and Peterborough City Council, which had been separate for 20, 30 years probably by the time we got there, still try to untangle those things. So untangling these things is not easy. But you just mentioned the travel to work area for St Ives, Huntingdon and St Neots. One of the pieces of data that I saw this week, which came to the conclusion that Huntingdonshire looks to the north for employment. And that's a wrong data point, based by people who don't understand the area, because that cannot be true. I'm sure people in Ramsey, and in Sawtry, and actually lots of people do look to the north to people for employment. But in the three biggest population settlements, especially St Ives, which is basically increasingly a cheap suburb of Cambridge, isn't it? Because you've got the busway and it's a great place to commute from. But St Neots looks, to London and to Cambridge, as does Huntingdon. And so to see a data point saying, clearly that Huntingdonshire looks to the north for employment is just not the case. And so the quality of the data being used to make these decisions and to justify them, in my view, is really, really poor. And we don't have enough time because, there's lots of pressure to start building. It costs money in consultants to build business cases. And there's a kind of a real desire to narrow down the options to a few options that we can explore and then take forward. But there's going to be, you talked about the fact that Fenland is completely Conservative control at district council level, which is what matters because they'll have the seats at the table. But you look now, at the last election, is controlled by Reform, who will have no seats at the table. Thank God, probably. But, in general, the political landscape has changed.
Yeah, but there's something important in the middle of that as well, which is that the political landscape will change going forwards as well.
Yeah, and has done since I was elected. But everything's changed, isn't it? Since just before I was elected, this was a Conservative county, Conservative district councils, Conservative mayor. We've got Conservative mayor again now, but everything changed last time, and everything changed again. It will continue to change.
Yeah, well, there is. I've said this for a long time. Within Fenland, the reason the Conservatives get in is because the opposition don't organise and don't coordinate and don't campaign. If we had somebody in Wisbech that campaigned in the way that Alex does, and that, yes, that's meant as a compliment, Alex. If we had somebody that campaigned in the way that Alex does, they would get elected. The people in Fenland do need the change. They just don't see the opportunity for it. So when you look at Fenland becoming part of Peterborough, the Labour Party are only ever going to stay in control of Peterborough in those circumstances if they campaign effectively in places like Fenland. And when that changes, the demographics, I think, in terms of the political demographics in Fenland will change. I'm pretty convinced of it. And so, I know there will be Conservatives from the city and from Fenland talking to each other and probably talking to Conservatives in Huntingdon saying, we should go for this because actually, we're quids in here. We'll win every time. They absolutely will not. And if that's the basis on which they're going forward with a proposal, it's flawed.
Go on, Alex.
That's the issue, to Martin's point. I think the political argument is based on the results as they are at the moment, or even pre-2025 type of results. Cambridge City, those Labour seats, and I said this and I'm happy to say this in public, many of them will be lost to the unitaries unless you put an extreme amount of work now. We have seen 5 Labour seats being lost to Lib Dems and Greens. That's the trend of politics. The Labour vote is moving, and this is overall, if you look at local elections in 25, especially in city wards, is moving towards Labour is losing more votes to the Lib Dems and Greens they do towards Reform in the cities. It's just reality. Of course, there's some Labour Reform areas, but that's not Cambridge City. So you can't really if I was the person making decisions, I think okay, what's best politically? The question is, where can I start work now? So in 3 years' time, when I have elections, I can actually build up support for, for actually gaining any seats, rather than we've never had seats in that area. We should just avoid that area completely because we'll never ever win there. Whilst we have to keep our seats that might be lost next time anyway because of how the shift of politics is going. Let's say in Cambridge City, I'm not convinced that the Labour seats will be held or Cambridge City Council will stay Labour. Peterborough is interesting as well because Labour have the group, I think, obviously with the leadership of the council, but they're not the largest group either, from the last time I checked. So again, it's there's no guarantee that you'll keep all of those seats or have enough for a majority anyway.
There are mutterings that there are things going on behind the scenes in Peterborough as well. I don't know how accurate those mutterings are, but that there's possibility that Labour won't run the council by the time we move the unitary, and I don't know that for certain, but certainly those mutterings are there. But you know, if I was the Labour Party and the Lib Dems in Finland, knowing that we are going to see, I believe we're going to see Reform collapse in the way that UKIP did. Of that, I'm reasonably confident with the start we've seen from Reform. You know, the fact that they can't decide whether they're keeping the chairman or not, you know, is an example. You know, I would be looking and saying, right, how do we springboard off that, and starting now with a, you know, you've tried the rest, we're the alternative. You know, start looking at us and campaigning from now, but it won't happen.
Yeah, and so my concern is exactly the same. Is that although there's lots, the decision will be justified using data and an economic basis. It will be made for political reasons, which is basically gerrymandering and trying to just keep the existing status quo into the new worlds of unitaries, which will mean that the right-leaning councils will probably want to work together, you know, and the left, more centrist councils will also want to work together, and they'll all be about building their own particular brand and hoping to hold it into the future, which you know, as somebody who is unashamedly not aligned with a political party, just makes me feel sick. Really, it's really sad. And even I think it's even different to that. There's in some of the political parties, there's factions within factions, and not all the political parties get on across. You know, the Labour County group always seemed very different than the Labour City group. Not that I have friends in both groups, you know, but they've got different ambitions and very different aims. And you get these different flavors of political parties, but they're all ultimately that. My fear is the decision will be taken along those grounds, but justified, by whatever economic and, you know, demographic data they can cobble together, and it's not going to be a scientific exercise.
I genuinely hope they don't do that for Cambridge. Cambridge City is too important a place for the economy to be put at risk by gerrymandering. And I know that might sound to some as a slight on Peterborough. It's not. Peterborough is an important place, and it's got a great economy. It's pro-growth. It's got a lot of potential, but actually, Cambridge City, you know, the amount of revenue it earns, tax revenue it earns for the government, the work it does that changes lives and saves lives. It's too important to be gerrymandered is a reality. But the point about split parties is right. You look at where I am. You know, I still consider myself a Conservative, but there's no way I could say that I support what conservatism is, both locally and nationally at the moment.
And yeah, that's true for sure. And one of the ways you can see the changing political picture in Cambridgeshire or Greater Cambridgeshire is the GCP, isn't it? GCP was a product of the Lib Dem and Conservative coalition, at national level, but also because they had strong support at local level. And actually, in the current iteration, it's been run by Labour councillors because they've taken control of City. But as Alex has said, you can see, you know, the impact of the Lib Dems and the Green Party kind of changing the demographics of, or the political control of Cambridge as well. And it's going to that's good actually for democracy that these things change. But trying to nail down the situation we are now for political purposes is it's dumb and selfish and won't lead to
I have to say that one of my big disappointments is the GCP. You know, personally, you know, having spent a huge amount of my time as leader helping to put the City deal together, to see that evolve into the GCP, and I have to say that Conservatives have played a role in that in more recent years, but in the early years, the other opposition parties it was almost a case where everybody was pointing the finger at the GCP for not delivering, and actually in a lot of the cases it was a responsibility of the politicians that sat on the GCP board, because they just weren't able politically, they just weren't able to make decisions. It was because it got so political and so difficult, and I think it's an absolute shame, actually.
I mean, I've seen that personally. I've seen that personally because, you know, a political friend is Elisa Machini, who's the leader of the county group. Yeah, also the leader of the GCP, chair of the GCP.
Not anymore. So now
she was.
Yeah,
she was. But all right.
Well, now it's Lib Dem, I think, because
okay,
obviously
good.
of the majority.
Good, but over the whole of the last 4 years,
Yeah.
the personal abuse that Elisa has faced, because of that role, implementing stuff that the previous, the Conservative controlled and Lib Dem controlled previous, running of the GCP started, trying to implement things like the I don't want to call it congestion charge. I forgot what it's called, but
Sustainable travel zone.
yeah, sustainable travel zone to try and reduce the amount of personal abuse that she took. I don't know how she did it and how she's in politics, because it was bloody awful. Really, really awful.
And actually, previous chief exec was the same. Actually, I have to say, but there is it's really important, some of that stuff about, we understand it, and you have to look at it from the perception of a business. If they had come in with the congestion charge, and I'm going to call it congestion charge, I don't believe in playing around with words. If that had been implemented, at least business would have had some certainty. And that's the most important thing that business want. They want to know where it's headed. That's why America is headed towards chaos, because business doesn't know where to turn, because, tariffs or no tariffs and all that stuff. And there's other issues as well. But it's the same. The most important thing business want, they don't necessarily want the perfect decision for them. That'd be nice. But I know from talking to my clients about the stuff I'm working on, what they want certainty. They want to know where they're headed, because they can work with that agenda.
And sometimes you don't pay the political consequences of difficult, sometimes unpopular decisions. So a case study in that is the green bin charges in Huntingdonshire, which I think, I was involved in, I support, has been a really good scheme in raising much needed funds for district council, and has a high adoption rate as well. I think we're up to almost 60% of eligible properties, which is years ahead of our target. But the opposition in Huntingdonshire, have made a huge fuss about that constantly. Green bin charges are unpopular, campaigning against it. That decision, was pinned on the Lib Dem led joint administration, which I'm a part of. It's going to be massively, the Conservatives campaign on it everywhere. You get to the elections in May, and the Lib Dems, win a massive victory, I think, in Huntingdonshire. At county council level, taking control of loads of council. It doesn't make any difference. And you do things which are unpopular, but actually doesn't really influence what happens downstream. Maybe because of the right decision, maybe because people
politicians aren't there to do what's popular. Politicians are there to campaign on a referendum, but that referendum should be about leadership. That manifesto should be about leadership, and it's about campaigning and delivering what is right. And what right and popular are not all the same thing. As a politician, you have access to information and data and people that will inform you far better than the general populace are. And that's the nature of the beast. For some people, that's shrunk a lot, because a lot of people are fantastic at researching. But there is a reality about that. And as a politician, you're there to listen to the voice of a community, listen to the voice of people, but you're also there to make the right decision for the council, and not just to listen to that voice and be a populist and stick your hand up because, say, X says X, or X says Y, and therefore I'm voting Y. That's not the role.
So on that note, this is a comment from one of our listeners, which I think is an incredibly astute comment. He says, Ashby says, I worry that one particular council, without naming which one, will be dragged kicking and screaming, and therefore not have a sustainable seat at the table, doing their residents a disservice. Now, in terms of, the decision ahead, and if you were a member of that council, who I'm not going to name, who might be forced into a unitary which wouldn't be their first choice. The question is do you stand your ground, and support the unitary that you think your residents would support, or do you accept what's going to happen probably and the likely outcome, and then just concede to being a part of a unitary that you're not particularly comfortable with, because perhaps it gives you a better seat at the table later on? Now, my feeling would that actually the size of your seat at the table later on probably won't be determined, by whether you're in support of a unitary or not. but might be determined by how well you you show your principles, you stick to your guns, and you know what, you're a credible voice would my argument. But it's a definite concern, is that, you know, do we just take the easier option, the option that's always going to be, or does that council, whoever it is, do they stick their toes and saying this is not what we want?
I think that you, right up until the decision is made, if you fundamentally believe that decision is wrong, you campaign for it, and you campaign and you campaign and you campaign for what you think is right. There comes a point where you have to go, yeah, we've lost that, we've got to move on now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think the important thing is knowing when you've reached that point.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, I will never like pretend that St. Ives looks more towards Peterborough than it does to Cambridge. It's just like the reality, like, you know, the economic reality, the travel to work reality, the distance reality. So I'm not going to say, oh, actually, like, if it was suggested that St. Ives should go with Peterborough, that's like the thing that makes most sense economically. So like, until I see data that tells me otherwise, I won't be arguing that. But I think at the same time, there's like this kind of like culture of like, you know, believing that like things will always like stay similar, like politically, to how they are. I remember having a conversation like months before, you know, like when I decided to put my name forward for St. Ives South and not to restand in my, you know, previous Cambridge seat. And someone who's, you know, in the city of Cambridge said, oh, that's like, you know, we'll never like, you know, have any seats outside of Cambridge City. Like, what on earth are you doing? Like, you should like only like stand in Cambridge City. There's no chance anywhere else. So I think until people campaign actually outside Cambridge City and prove that actually politics can change if you put in the effort, like, you won't be taken seriously. Like, I actually think like after the results in May, some people like were really shocked. They said like, oh, actually, like, you put the effort in and, you know, things can change politically. Before, I think most people thought like, you know, what on earth are you doing? Like, it will never be like a Labour seat in St. Ives. And I'm like, well, we just had like, you know, in 2022, Kath Gleda won in the district council. Like, there are already, but I think some people have this impression that the only kind of, you know, Labour, you know, power is always in the cities. And, you know, until that is proven wrong from a elections point of view, I don't think many people will change their mind, unfortunately.
Yeah. I don't disagree, but I think with all of these things, I do think it's the point, and knowing the point at which you've got to go, okay, we're there, therefore, you know, what I'm doing is changing now. Yeah,
and then you wholeheartedly put yourself into wherever you are, which is the only way of dealing things, isn't it? I mean, you know, whatever future we have, as long as, well, I probably still won't be a councillor when it actually happens, but you know, in the build up to that, when it's been decided, then whatever is decided will have my full support for sure. But yeah, I'd agree with you, Martin, is that I want to represent my residents who don't have a voice. I don't really have a voice, but, you know, as much influence as I have, I'll continue to try and apply right until the last breath, I think.
I would argue that you do have influence. You know, it might, how much difference it makes depends on others, but you certainly want to try and exert influence if you've got something to say. And I think I think we'd all do that. But my difficulty with this whole issue about local government reform is that Huntingdonshire is going to lose out. That's my big fear, and it bothers me a lot because it's a good council, Huntingdonshire.
I think the general public don't really see what's coming as well. So, you know, the constant theme in St. Neots is St. Neots doesn't like Huntingdonshire District Council, despite the fact that up until recently, more than half the cabinet, has been from St. Neots, St. Neots local champions, will still believe that Huntingdonshire only cares about Huntingdon, which is frankly bollocks. Sorry, I shouldn't use that language. But, Huntingdon is a lot closer than Peterborough and Wisbech, and so when that change comes, I think people are going to have a shock on their hands when they're looking to a Peterborough and Fenland oriented council. Is going to be a big difference to places like St. Neots and Huntingdon and St. Ives, and it's going to be interesting times.
That issue in St. Neots has been around for as long as I can remember, though. I remember going to St. Neots Council and talking to the town council when I was leader. and basically getting told that all the money goes north to Wisbech, and then you go to a council up in Wisbech and a parish council in Wisbech, and they say, "Oh, all the money goes there and goes here," and it's the nature of the beast, and you sort of. It's not to say you ignore it, but you stick it at the back of your mind, and until you start seeing evidence that says otherwise, you just take it as the nature of those guys in St Neots sticking up for St Neots like they're supposed to.
Yep. Yeah, well, that takes us past the hour meeting, and it's Sunday, and I'm sure people have got Sunday dinners to prepare. If you do those kind of, are you having a Sunday lunch these days today, guys?
I'm going canvassing.
Oh God! What about you, Martin?
I'll have a lunch at the coffee, maybe at Costa and St Ives. I don't know. I haven't decided yet.
Have you got a big roast in the oven, Martin?
I believe my good lady is sorting out pulled pork, actually.
Oh, nice. Nice.
So something a bit different. Yeah.
All right.
But
So we'll just have them. Go on. Sorry.
Meantime, I'm going out there to garden.
Yeah, I might have to do that as well now. I can feel the pull of my wife. I don't have a roast plan, but we always have nice food anyway, so that's fine. So this felt like quite a good time actually, but we'll have a chat and see when we do it next time. But until then, thank you for listening.
Can I just say thanks to everybody for dialing in and commenting?
Yeah, of course, always. Yeah, it's always good. It's nice to have people watching on a Sunday.
Yeah,
all
definitely.
Right.
And there'll
have
be
a good week,
more
everyone.
controversial things to come up soon.
We'll be back next week, almost certainly. All right.
Thank you all.
See you later, guys.
Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Cheers, all. See ya.